quite exciting to do it this way. Huh? Interesting.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Very, very excited to have you all here with us. Bear with us while we just work out some minor tech issues. I hope everybody can hear me okay. We are super thrilled to be hosting an amazing gathering of panelists this evening in our discussion all about egg donation. We have a panel, a selection of experts in the field coming from all different parts of the egg donor experience, starting with the medical, then we're going to hear about the Jewish halachic perspective, and then we're going to hear a personal account. So I'm just going to confirm. Josh, are we ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. All right, so thank you. And a big thank you to our tech assistant this evening who is helping us out. Our first guests this evening are Dr. Joel Bernstein and Denyse Asher. Dr. Joel Bernstein is a fertility specialist who is trained in the UK, South Africa, and Australia. He has developed and run successful IVF units in both South Africa and Australia. He has such a long list of qualifications that I'm actually not going to share them all because we will be here for a very long time. But I will tell you that he is a fellow of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in London and of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, obviously in Australia and New Zealand. Dr. Bernstein is an associate of the Centre for Human Reproduction in Athens, Greece, and a member of the Fertility Society of Australia, as well as a member of the European Society of Human Reproduction and Endocrinology. Denyse Asher, who joins Dr. Bernstein this evening, is a scientist who's been involved with human reproduction and the treatment of infertile couples for over 35 years. Her initial training was in chemical pathology. Denyse was Joel's principal scientist, assisting him in developing his IVF facilities in South Africa and subsequently in Australia. She was one of the first scientists in South Africa to obtain a Bachelor of Science degree in reproductive biology. Denyse is a member of the Australian Institute of Medical Scientists, of Scientists in Reproductive Technology, and of the Fertility Society of Australia. So the way this evening is going to run is we're going to start with Joel and Denyse, who are going to give us the medical side of things. Then there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Please use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and we will direct them to Joel and Denyse. Following Joel and Denyse, we're going to hear from Rabbi Ulman, and the same procedure will follow, and then we'll move on to Roseanne. Any pressing questions that you have, please pop them in. We will do our best to address all of them. And I'm going to now step back and hand over to Joel and then Denyse. And thank you in advance for your wisdom.
Hi, everybody. And I'd just like to thank the AJFN on behalf of Donor Eggs Australia for inviting us to come and chat about a topic which has been very dear to our heart for many, many years. Basically, Denyse, my wife, and Nikki is a fellow director of the Donor Eggs Australia, and I act as their advisor. The one thing just to make clear at the beginning, and I've got a very short time to try and get through quite a lot. It's easier to make a baby with IVF and utilize the time we've got, is basically I act as an advisor for Donor Eggs Australia, and I don't actually consult directly with patients anymore, but hopefully provide any expertise that is needed. So in a way, I suppose we are both egg experts, excuse the pun, and let's move on very rapidly. Our interest began in 1986 when we achieved a world first surrogate pregnancy. That was a grandmother utilizing her daughter's eggs and son-in-law's sperm because the daughter had lost her uterus, and she carried triplets who now today are over 30 years old. And it was really good luck that we achieved this. I don't think it was any brilliance on our part. This patient actually came to us and said she's read about this thing called IVF, and she just wondered whether we could do it. So that was our first patient. We have subsequent patients since. And currently to date, we have more than 800 live births. And I think we must have the biggest series of donor egg pregnancies in Australia to date. The only other thing to mention is that we have no affiliations with any IVF clinics in Australia, remain completely independent. I used to be the medical director at Monash IVF, but since retirement from there, even though I'm fully registered, I no longer have any connections. So who needs donor eggs? Well, any patient, any female patient who's had ovarian failure through genetics, disease, surgery, and those are very easy, unfortunately, to diagnose. The second group of patients are patients who may have a genetic disease which currently can't be tested, and so they want to prevent children developing these conditions. But the biggest group of patients we face are really patients with infertility who've had many failed attempts at treatment and really are wondering where do they go and what do they do. And I'm sure that makes up the bulk of our audience and will address all of you. There are three main points I would like to make. First of all, I'd like to provide you with proper fertility information, facts, not fiction. Secondly, I would like to very briefly discuss the medical aspects of the donor egg programs, which I must point out are under the control of the doctors who run the overseas donor egg clinics, and Donor Eggs Australia merely coordinates and interprets their instructions to help you and make life easy. And lastly, I'd just like to discuss the results that donor eggs obtain. When it comes to infertility, there's some important fertility facts that you have to understand. The first is, what is normal human fertility? And if we look at a 30-year-old or female under 30 years old who attempts to fall pregnant on one particular month, she has a 25% chance of a live birth. And if you compare her, and I'm not being rude in any way, say to a cow has an 85% chance under the same circumstances. So human beings as a species are not very fertile, and therefore multiple attempts at trying to fall pregnant, whether naturally or using treatment, is vital. So most people actually believe they're more fertile than they are. And with the world population topping out at 8.5 odd billion, I think that we forget how relatively poorly fertile we are or how much effort is needed. Besides humans not being very fertile, the second important fertility fact is female age. And unfortunately, as females grow older, their chances of having a baby decreases, and especially after the age of 35. This is both for natural fertility, and this is also for treatment. So in order to put this into perspective, because I'm certain a number of patients or our guests this evening have had attempts at IVF were not successful, I use a rough guideline. It's not absolutely specific and it won't apply to everybody, but it does in general, to give you an idea of IVF success rate versus female age. So if we consider all the embryos generated in one IVF cycle, and our patient is under 30 years of age, these embryos have the potential to generate 2 to 3 live births. Between the ages of 30 years to just under 35 years, one treatment cycle, meaning all the embryos from one cycle, will generate about 1 to 2 live births. But here's where things start to get difficult. Between the ages of 35 and 40, we require up to 3 treatment cycles. Those are full cycles to get 1 live birth. And over the age of 40, it becomes even more difficult. So the take-home message is, as with infertility, we need more cycles and not, as often incorrectly reported, more eggs per cycle. In fact, trying to get more eggs per cycle often generates more eggs that work less well, and so it's the incorrect approach to this. And the last infertility fact that's important is currently today, there is no specific test to determine whether an egg and or sperm are fertile and what the ability of them is, or an embryo, to produce a live birth. Other than testing their genetics, we're stuck. So let's have a very brief overview of what Donor Eggs Australia provides with the help of our overseas medical colleagues. First of all, there are 2 basic components. We begin with a detailed history and investigations. So all the treatments that patients have undergone and testing will be reviewed, and if any tests are missing or any results are suspicious, they will be repeated. And I'd like to highlight a critical point, is that one has to test not only the uterus, but the cavity of the uterus. So when patients have had a transvaginal ultrasound scan, which looks at the uterus, it actually does not correctly and in detail test the cavity. To do this, one has to have a test called a hycosi, where fluid is put into the uterine cavity and it's tested, or a hysteroscopy. And if this hasn't been done, you have not been fully tested for infertility, let alone for anything else. We also would assess any additional risks that age and health status can add to you as the result of a pregnancy, as a lot of our patients are in their early 40s. In fact, the odd patient will even get up to the age of 50. And pregnancy has effects on age and health, and we'll refer you to any specific specialist to ensure that this is not a problem. Okay, how about getting onto the individualized treatment cycle? So what, from a medical point of view, is being done? Well, your treatment plan is worked out by our colleagues overseas, and it's instituted by Denyse and Nikki here in Australia. And Denyse will go into more details about it. But the significant point where the treatment program varies between many other treatments offered is each cycle is individualized, meaning it's planned for you individually. But more important, your progress on the treatment cycle in terms of the medication you take and the response that your uterus makes to this medication is monitored with blood levels and ultrasound. And if things do not progress according to our protocol, then your treatment cycle will be modified and improved. And should, in a very small number of cases, the cycle not develop the way we wish, we will cancel the cycle and basically plan a repeat cycle at no extra cost to the patient. So we don't send patients to waste embryos for embryo transfer if we don't believe the uterus is completely receptive. In addition, Donor Eggs Australia provide detailed information and support. So patients are provided with a spreadsheet showing daily testing and blood tests, and Denyse and Nikki are available on their mobiles 24/7 not only during the planning phase, but even when patients leave to go overseas for treatment, then they're available and often are concerned as they may not understand language or have a difficulty. We hear and we deal with these calls sometimes in the middle of the night. And last but not least, when monitoring these individual treatment cycles, we also monitor the results of the treating clinic. And there has been one occasion where we've had to stop using once in inverted commas popular clinic because their results dropped drastically and we changed to a different clinic. Let's now just have a very brief look at the Donor Eggs Australia success rate. Success rate with IVF clinics and treatments that are published are described in many different ways, and it's often confusing for patients. The first thing is a pregnancy rate. Pregnancy rate is described as the presence of a pregnancy diagnosed by ultrasound at 6 weeks, showing an active fetal heart. So it doesn't give us an idea of the live birth, it just tells us how many embryos have implanted and created little embryo that is actually alive. And pregnancies will be lost right up until live birth. And so this is not currently the best test. The live birth rate, which quite simply means the chance of a live birth per embryo transfer, will give you some idea of what your chances are of falling pregnant at your particular age group. And a success rate that I pay a lot of attention to is the cumulative live birth rate, which is the number of live birth rates you get per stimulated cycle, something I mentioned earlier on. So currently in Donor Eggs Australia, and this has been the case for the last 4 to 5 years, the pregnancy rate achieved by the Donor Egg Australia team, that is per embryo transfer, and normally this means 2 embryos being transferred, is 81%. And the live birth rate per embryo transfer, again, usually 2 embryos, either fresh or frozen, is running at 75%, which in fact puts the results of Donor Eggs Australia, I would say, in the top 5th centile in the world in terms of outcome. Our incidence of twins, because 2 embryos are invariably what's put back, is 10%. So to all of you who are listening, and I know I've had to go through this rather rapidly, but our time is so restricted. I've tried to give you a very brief overview. Denyse and I, once Denyse has finished talking, will be more than happy to answer any questions. And then should any of you not wish to discuss things either on a personal or just individual note, you are more than welcome to contact Denyse and Nikki, and they're happy to take you through the process in far more detail as they'd have far more time. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks for inviting me. And here's Denyse.
Good evening, everyone. As Joel said, I'm Denyse, and I and Nikki run Donor Eggs Australia. The status quo in Australia is that there is a critical shortage of egg donors in Australia. This is due in part to the legislation that we have. Every state has got slightly different legislation, but all of them have the common legislation is that you're only allowed to do identifiable donation. So what does that mean? That means that if I became an egg donor and a child or children were born of my donation, that I would agree that I could be contacted by that child or that young adult when they are 18 years or above. And in addition, places like New South Wales have a government register that they insist that the donor and the recipient are on. And when we used to have people who would come forward and share the plight of infertility patients, they may think to themselves, well, I can do this with 1 or 2 cycles of my life. But what they don't want to commit to is to being contacted 20 odd years later when they don't know where their lives will be at that stage. So overnight, which is about a decade and a half ago now, there became a critical shortage of egg donors. And in a large part, our success rate at Donor Eggs Australia is due to the fact that we are using fresh eggs. So in other words, a donor is coordinated with the recipient, and synchronously the donor develops her ovarian stimulation at the same time as we will be developing our recipient's endometrial stimulation. When eggs are retrieved, a partner, husband, or donor sperm is taken, embryos are formed and grown to an advanced embryonic stage called a blastocyst, and 1 or 2 are transferred into the recipient, and any leftover embryos that are of good enough quality will be frozen for that patient to use at any later stage. The other options in Australia is trying to advertise for an egg donor, which is unfortunately remarkably unsuccessful. And in addition, there are websites that they say they'll find a donor for you, but I can't think back over the last 2 decades of where somebody has gone forward with a donor who they found on the internet. However, I have spoken to many patients who have spent many years and a lot of money investigating potential donors who change their mind or disappear or do other things like that. What looks like an easy option over the last few years has been the presence of frozen eggs that are sent in from outside of Australia, mainly one from America and the other one that used to be out of the Ukraine that seems to have regrouped out of Georgia now. And this seems like a great option. You don't have to travel anywhere. You can choose the criteria of your donor, and they comply with the legislation in the different states like Victoria and New South Wales, Queensland, etc. And it's not a cheap option. It can cost patients up to $35,000. We've spoken to patients who've spent $125,000 on these eggs and unfortunately not achieved a pregnancy. And due to technical things of freezing eggs versus freezing embryos, which I won't go into, as well as other issues, the live birth rate of this is just very low, and it's not a cost-effective way of trying to move forward and to have a family. So therefore, we found ourselves in a situation to sit in front of people and tell them what you can't do for them is not particularly helpful. So we decided to look around the world and see where could we send an Australian patient to get to the top of somebody's list at a reasonable cost with a good success rate and a short amount of time away from Australia. And that is what we have been doing over these last years, up to 18 years, and we've had hundreds and hundreds of babies born from this method alone. The first place that we started working with was the largest privately owned IVF unit in Athens, in Greece, owned by a Dr. Pantos, who was born and educated in Melbourne, and he returned to live in Greece when his parents went back. And we found a place which was associated with Australia, and we could get our patients to the top of the list without any major waiting times. And we have worked with them ever since and have had hundreds of babies born from their clinic alone. The reason why the 2 places that I'm going to mention tonight, the reason why they've got these young donors that are able to come forward and do a donation is that they have the opposite legislation to what we have here. So all the donors have their medical checkups, they have their histories taken, they have their genetic testing done, they are counseled, and all of that is done, but the law in those 2 countries is that they are only allowed to do de-identifiable. So what that means is that you can certainly tell your child that they've been created from a donor egg, but when that child is 18 or above, they couldn't contact the clinic and ask for the name of the donor. And what the Greek clinic is able to do is to be able to find a donor of the physical criteria that our recipient would request in terms of hair color, eye color, skin, height, and build. And they match that up, and they do that very well. We often find people who are thinking about Greece but want blonde hair and blue eyes, and they have plenty of that around. So I can show you the blondest and blue-eyed children coming out of the Greek program. For them to find a donor of the criteria that you would request, test them, counsel them, provide them with the drugs that they need in order to hyperstimulate their ovaries, monitor them with blood tests and ultrasound, theatre, anaesthetist, fertility doctor, and scientist to get the eggs out, fertilization and growing these embryos along to a blastocyst stage, including all of that and embryo transfer into the recipient, you would pay them over their 6,000 euros, which is incredibly reasonable, given that if one did a local cycle here in Australia, the government provide rebates for infertility patients, but when you're putting a donor patient, a donor of eggs through, she's not an infertile patient, the recipient is paying all her fees, but she doesn't receive the rebates that one gets when one's doing a cycle oneself, and it can cost $15,000 to $18,000 locally. So 6,000 euros is incredibly reasonable. It would require the person to be there for 14 days on the ground. And the law in Australia is that any person who gives birth to a child is by law the child's mother. So there's no further things that need to be done. These embryos cannot be brought back into any state within Australia because they would have been created from de-identifiable donation and not identifiable. So our patients travel to the embryos and not the other way around. The other place that we've been using over the past decade or so is in Cape Town in South Africa, my hometown, very beautiful city, and certainly one which 2 weeks in Cape Town is no hardship whatsoever. And it works slightly differently in South Africa in that the clinics themselves do not recruit donors. So there's a separate agency that develops in order to find women who would go forward and become an egg donor for you. And our patients are able to get onto the website of the agency that we work with and have a look at de-identified information about the donor. They're not allowed to get their name as per their law, and they're not allowed to see adult photos, but they are able to put up childhood photos, and you would know everything about them, their family, their education, their likes and dislikes and strengths and weaknesses. And the difference is you would choose the donor, and that donor would go forward to the clinic to become your egg donor. In order to deal with these two separate entities in South Africa, the donor egg agency, as well as the clinic that does everything that I mentioned the Greek clinic does, is about 11,500 Australian dollars. It's the same for a fresh cycle, be there for 14 days. And the role that Donor Eggs Australia plays, Joel's gone over that, but one of our most important roles, besides facilitating all the medical testing and monitoring, is the emotional support that Nikki and I are able to give our patients, because trying to deal with a clinic overseas in different time zones with different communications, sometimes different languages, it can be very stressful. You know, trying to deal with donor eggs is stressful enough in itself. And so we would liaise between the clinic of their choice and themselves. We would get all of their testing done and take them through the cycles. They don't need to work through any of the fertility specialists on the ground. And finally, I just wish that in Australia, we would have the option, because there's donors that would like to be identifiable and there are donors that don't want to be identifiable, the same as there are recipients that would like to have identifiable donation, and there are recipients that absolutely do not want somebody else coming into their life at a later stage. So that's our program. It's highly successful, and it's a plan B that if all else doesn't work out, because remember, we are working with patients who are at the end of their fertility pathway, not at the beginning, and to be able to offer these kind of success rates is very satisfying as well.
Thank you, Denyse and Joel. Wow, so interesting. You've given us lots of food for thought. I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
So question number one, if someone wanted to be an egg donor, do you recommend it only for women who've completed their family?
Joel will answer
that. If someone wanted to be an egg donor, there's so many parts to this question. I think it'll take me 10 minutes to try and answer it. I mean, basically, if somebody wants to be an egg donor, I suppose ideally, are you saying, do they want to choose a recipient themselves or not? And I assume we're talking in Australia where they'd have to be. So you can be a known donor. I mean, the law doesn't prevent a known donor from donating. It could even be one's own sibling, like a sister. And I'm sure Rabbi Ulman will speak more on that later on, but the law allows for that. So you can be.
But do you recommend that the donor only donate the eggs once they themselves have finished having children? Or is it?
Oh, sorry, I understand what you're saying. I think the risks of donating eggs are actually very small. I suppose the question behind that question is there a risk to the woman's fertility if she donates eggs? And at least in my life experience and looking at the literature, I don't think I've ever come across a case where a woman has jeopardized her own fertility by donating eggs. So the answer would be no. And the other problem is if she leaves it to donate eggs till she's completed her family, she's invariably too old to become an adequate donor. So donors, once they get over the age of 35, already have problems. And so a friend who comes to somebody and says, look, I've had my kids, I'm now 40 years old, I've had lots of children, there's nothing wrong with me, she's too late to be a donor. Yeah.
So, and we have another question for you. I'm not sure whether this is for Denyse or Joel. Have you seen a difference in success with donor eggs that have been frozen for several years?
Donor eggs or donor embryos?
The question is donor eggs.
Yep. So in terms of freezing, when you freeze something metabolically, it is frozen in time. It's not frozen for a limited amount of time. So whatever the prognosis of that freezing eggs or embryos is at the time of freezing, so it will be when they are thawed out. And I think we've just seen last week in Australia, a pregnancy from embryos that have been frozen for 30 years. It makes no difference if they were frozen for 30 days or 30 years. The clinics try and put a limit on how long they will keep these gametes for you, because otherwise people would just get on with their life, forget about those, and they'd have tanks and tanks full of sperm and eggs that aren't being used.
Can I just add to that question? Sorry, very quickly.
Yes.
Young women who considering freezing their eggs, the take-home message in where I mentioned is it's the number of cycles, not the number of eggs. In fact, I'm quite happy if a woman only gets 3 eggs, because the probability of is there a good egg will be in the 3 rather than in 12 or 20, which means you'll have a lot of embryos that won't work. But more important, if she's going to freeze her eggs, and I'm not involved with any clinic, so this is not a ploy for more work, they should at least consider 3 cycles of freezing her eggs to have a reasonable chance of getting a baby. I mean, unless she's under 30 years of age, but a minimum of 2 freeze cycles before you do anything.
And one final question, and I'm not sure whether you will know the answer to this. This might be a Rabbi Ulman question. Is there such a thing as a Jewish egg donor bank? Have you ever come across a Jewish egg donor bank?
No, in South Africa, in South Africa, I've seen some of the donors who've had one part of their parents would be Jewish and another part not, but I've never seen a Jewish donor bank. In the States, I'm sure that such things exist, but
you could request a donor who's Jewish,
yeah.
which is possible.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know that in Israel, one of the biggest companies actually uses Eastern Europe for eggs, and I don't think they got many Jewish people that are coming through there. But yeah.
And the other thing I think quickly to mention is that most people, if they've been successful from a cohort of their own embryos, they don't donate the remaining embryos on, because those would be full siblings of their own children. So that tends to be a Rubicon across which they simply can't see, as well as the fact that some places offer people leftover embryos, and it's not a great idea because there are 1 or 2 pregnancies per cohort of embryos that one develops. And if the patients themselves have already achieved that, then the leftover embryos we go from 80% pregnancy rate down to 30%. And so it's in one's interest to use the best embryos that one can get by creating them. Yeah.
Super. We do have one more question, but I'm aware that we're running short on time. So I'm going to ask the question, and if we have time later, we'll come back to the answer. But the question is, do you recommend that women in their early to mid 30s be encouraged to freeze their eggs?
Simple answer, yes.
Oh, it's a yes. Okay, there you go. It's a yes. All right. Thank you, Joel and Denyse. Always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you for your time. And as Joel and Denyse said in their opening, they're here if anyone has questions, wants advice, wants to ask a question outside of a public forum. Please be in touch with someone at AJFN and we will happily connect you on to Joel and Denyse. I'm now super thrilled to introduce you to our next speaker, Rabbi Ulman. Rabbi Ulman was born in the former USSR and was educated at Moriah College in Sydney, which means there's hope for my children to become great rabbis, and the Yeshiva Gedola in Melbourne. He continued his studies in the USA, receiving smicha from the Central Lubavitcher Yeshiva, Tomchei Tamimim. Rabbi Ulman is active in so many different forums, but specifically in our interests here this evening, in the Beth Din, and has particular expertise globally in halachically acceptable fertility treatments. And he oversees the Sydney Beth Din's highly successful kosher IVF program. Rabbi Ulman is a wealth of knowledge, very accessible, great to talk to. And we're super excited, Rabbi Ulman, that you've joined us this evening. So I'm going to hand over to you. Josh will make sure that you're in the spotlight next. And I'll put myself on mute. And if you have any questions, please pop them into the questions Q&A. Rabbi, we already have a few questions for you just in advance. Some people have already asked before you've spoken. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine and AHFN for organizing this forum. I will echo what Joel said. And Joel was somebody that I worked for many years with kosher IVF. He was one of the clinics that we worked very well with in Sydney. And I think the hardest part of talking tonight is how to be able to condense everything into those 20 minutes that I'm allocated to speak. Because so I'm going to try to say very general things, and I'm always ready to discuss on a personal level at a greater length all of the issues associated with this. So first of all, my topic is to discuss the halachic aspects of egg donation. And the question is, what does it mean, halachic stand on something like that, something which is so cutting edge and so modern? And the answer is that Jewish law has what to say about everything. We don't shy away from modern technology, no matter what it medical or scientific or whatever it may be, but we'll look at it substantively to see how does it affect different aspects of Jewish law. And specifically with fertility, we have to be very mindful of the fact that we're talking about the future of our people, but the Jewish people was always of paramount importance. Our children, the continuity of the Jewish people, and how fertility affects Jewish status. And that is why the discussion evolved immediately as soon as those technologies became available, whether regular IVF between the husband and wife, and we certainly developed a very, very thorough protocol, which was called in Sydney kosher IVF. And again, we work with all the major clinics and very well with Joel. Especially if with kosher IVF, we have to make sure to have a separate hashgacha, a separate supervision, not connected to the clinic. So when we're talking about including partners in having children, obviously it raises many questions. I won't hide the fact, it's something which is not honest not to mention, that there is controversy in Jewish law, and it's a polemic, it's an argument about permissibility of accepting partners into having children, whether we're talking about sperm donors or egg donors or surrogate mothers. But also it would be very dishonest not to say that many of the great halachic decisors do allow it under certain conditions. And therefore today I will focus not about the discussion of before the fact, but after the fact, once the couple is either doing it or already had a child through egg donation, what are the laws associated with it? And over here we have, and by the way, and the reason, just like Joel said it so quickly when he was asked the question whether we encourage young ladies, after they reach the age of 30 and haven't yet got married, to freeze the eggs. Certainly, I agree with him 100%. We certainly do encourage. Obviously, when it comes to Jewish young ladies, we do it under the protocol of kosher IVF. And that ensures, it's like an insurance policy that, whenever they get married, they're able to use their own eggs rather than resorting to donors. But today we're discussing a situation when the couple decided that there's no choice and they have to be able to, either because of ovarian failure syndrome or because of premature menopause, the couple decided to go ahead with it. And then my job would be to be able to explain the protocol and explain what would it take. And couples could be, as Justine said, globally, not just in Sydney, Australia, and we counsel hundreds of couples to make sure that at the end of the day, the children will be Jewish and without any arguments, without any discussions. And one of the major questions about, connected with egg donations is a polemic, an argument among halachic decisors, which I would venture to say is the most polemic of all the cutting edge and modern questions. And it's not resolved. It's resolved to a certain extent as far as how to apply it in reality, but the theory behind it wasn't resolved. And the question is, what is the yichus of the child? The yichus meaning his status. Does it go after the gestational mother, the birth mother, or after the egg donor? Now, I want to make it very clear that we're not talking over here who is the mother. The mother, of course, is the one that if a couple initiate a process, whether the couple need the services of an egg donor or surrogate mother, obviously they are the parents. They are the ones initiating the process. They are the ones raising the child. We're not questioning that. All we're talking about is a technical halachic question about the halachic status of the child. Does the halachic status is connected to the birth mother, to the gestational mother, or to the genetic mother, which is the owner of the eggs? And this is a question which I said before, it's extremely polemic. It's not resolved. Like any halachic question, it doesn't depend on how, it's not about how the rabbi feels. It's not a question of how a particular rabbi got up in the morning and to him it makes more sense one way or the other. Every halachic question has its text precedents and foundations from the Talmud and the codes. And believe it or not, no matter how modern the question is, it does have on particular level precedents. And I might, if I have time, I might give you some examples. Even, when we're talking about genetics and using mitochondrial DNA, which is another topic I give lectures on, whether you can use that particular method to help determine Jewish status, it also, believe it or not, it has its roots and its precedence in the Jewish law. We all know, anybody who's on this forum, that while the child has its yichus, it's connected to the parents who gave birth to the child. So from the father is very simple, because a male has only one reproductive system. A woman has two independent systems. Both are necessary to have a child, but they're completely independent of each other. So in order for a woman to have a child without any help from other women, you need to have ovaries and eggs to be able to conceive, to be able to have the sperm together with the egg produce an embryo. And then you need to have a uterus in order to be able to carry the child. If one of those is missing, then they need to have help from another woman, either surrogate mother or an egg donor. And the question is, who is the technical halachic mother which determines the status of the child? And over here we have very strong opinions either way. If I were to make it very simple, I would say there are 7 opinions. That's already simplifying it, because there are opinions which are very extreme, very few opinions that are so sure they're saying one way or the other. There was a great rabbi called Rabbi Mordechai Leo. He felt very strongly that the birth mother is the one that dictates the yichus of a child, and he brought proof for that. There was a great rabbi called Rabbi Amar, the previous chief rabbi of Israel, who is very strong in maintaining that it's only the genetic mother that dictates the status of a child. But there are many, many opinions in between. Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, he maintained, and he was a great, great halachic Denyse, so passed away in 1995, and he maintained that, he said, for every single question I was asked, no matter how cutting edge, how modern the question is, I was able to find precedents in the Talmud and the codes. He said, when it comes to this particular question, for every powerful argument you will give me one way, I will give you an equally powerful argument the other way. And he maintained that it has to be a 50-50 suffix, which means an equal doubt, and you have to always go to the side of caution. And if, for example, one of the mothers is not Jewish, you have to convert the child. And all the other opinions in between, on different levels, maintain the same approach, even though some of them would say that we're leaning more towards one of the mothers dictating the status. They would still say there is an element of doubt, and therefore there has to be a giur, either misafek, which means a giur to eliminate or alleviate doubt, or a giur lechumra, which means as a stringency. So obviously, the more you sure yourself, the less is the less necessity it is to have this conversion, but nevertheless the conversion is necessary in order to be able to give the child 100% open door that nobody should doubt the child. It was decided in the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years in the chief rabbinate of Israel that we can't have a change of opinion depending on who is the chief rabbi and so on and so forth, and therefore they decided that no matter what, you have to go to the side of caution. And whatever our opinion may be, we still have to be able to make sure that the child is Jewish according to all opinions. And therefore, whether the surrogate mother is, or the birth mother, I should rather say, because sometimes the birth mother is not the surrogate mother, whether the birth mother is Jewish and the egg owner of the eggs, the egg donor is not, or vice versa, we do, at the request of the couple, we assist them to be able to make sure that the child is converted in the most efficient manner, in the most sensitive way when they are very young. The question is, when the couple comes to us and they tell us that they're going in a direction and they want to consult to find out the best way to do it. A lot of couples, they consult already during pregnancy or after birth because they never knew there was an issue. And many couples come and consult before the fact. They want to know what are the implications and what is the best way to go. So the first question they ask is, what is better, to have a Jewish egg donor or a non-Jewish egg donor? So first of all, I want to say that to the question that was asked before, is there such a thing as an agency or a bank of Jewish donors? And the answer is definitely yes. There are I work with 3 or 4 of them. The reason why it's, and I'm going to give you a protocol in order to explain that it's not enough for the agency to be able to say, yeah, we're going to give you a Jewish egg. Because in Jewish law, there's, we can see it, as much as we have full trust in the clinics that we work with. We work together with Joel's clinic, and it was the fact that we had a separate supervision was never ever an indication of lack of trust. It's just in Jewish law, there has to be a certain level of the source of information has to be independent of in the secular society. There's also, we find the concept of conflict of interest, which is not an indication of distrusting somebody, but it makes it cleaner and more accountable and more ethical. For example, we work with, we developed a protocol for organ donations, how to do it in a kosher way, to be an organ donor. Now, even in a secular society, what we found was that there are 2 separate departments. The department that determines the brain death cannot be the one administering the organ donations. There has to be this separation. There can be this situation where you have the same department working on 2 different goals. So when it comes to even the regular IVF, we have a separate supervision. When it comes to the question of determining the Jewish status of the donor, it's not enough for us. It wouldn't help the couple and wouldn't help the child that the agency said that the donor was Jewish. How do we know which criteria they used? If they used the halachic criteria of what, being Jewish. And therefore, when I'm asked the question, what is better, to have a Jewish donor or non-Jewish donor? There are pros and cons both ways. And ultimately, even though you could say that it's better to have a Jewish donor because the child wouldn't need to be converted, but it's only worthwhile if you cover all the details and you make it perfect, then it's worthwhile. So I'll give you an example. How do we do it? I work, as I mentioned before, with all of the agencies that I know that specialize in Jewish donors. And even though, as was mentioned by Joel and Denyse, there is in America, certainly there's a law of that it's forbidden, it's illegal for the couple to know the identity of the donor. For some reason, it doesn't apply to surrogate mothers. They can be friendly with them, they can know who they are, but with donors, they can't know who they are. They can know everything about them, they can know how they look, they can know, because they want to choose the child according to their specifications, but they can't know the name or the identity. It doesn't apply to the rabbi. So I have what I do with the donors, with their consent, the donors are very happy to cooperate. We certify them in exactly the same way as we would certify a couple getting married. In Sydney, when a couple wants to get married, like in South Africa, anybody who came from South Africa would know the same thing, that when a couple gets married, they are referred to the Beth Din, and the Beth Din has to certify them, approve their kosher status before the rabbi is able to be Masad the Kiddushin and conduct the wedding. And I would certify the potential egg donor or surrogate mother for that matter, in exactly the same way. She would fill out a form, she sends her documents, I interview her online. We discuss not just the question of Jewish status, but other aspects of kosher status that will impact on the child, which I might mention later on. And once we approve usually with most of the couples that I work with, they use fresh donors, not frozen eggs, even though there is also banks. When we approve a lady who will go for a bank, we will write a letter approving her, but in a small footnote, we say that it doesn't apply to the child. We can't approve the child before the fact. We have no idea who she will give her eggs to, so therefore we're only approving the actual donor and not yet the child. If it's the donor we're going to use her eggs for the couple that we are guiding, that under my guidance, then we supervise the whole cycle. So first of all, it's a kosher IVF, so it's under supervision. On top of it, the mashgicha identifies the donor on the day right prior to the retrieval of the egg. And I keep all the files, and that's for the protection of the child. So later on, I can write with complete certainty, and my certification is trusted all around the world. I write a letter, the child is Jewish without any doubt. And for me to do it, we go through all of that particular protocol in order to be able to have all the details taken care of. We don't have a married woman to be a donor. So if a woman is married under Jewish law, if she's married to a non-Jew, that's not a problem. But if she's married to a Jew under Chuppah v'Kiddushin, she's a married lady, and we don't want, at least as a initial permission. If it happened already, we deal with it, and we try to make sure the child is not, doesn't have the mamzer status attached to him or her. But beforehand, we want to make sure that according to all opinion, it's done above board, and therefore we only have single girls or not married according to Jewish law. We don't have sisters, direct relatives donating eggs.
So, Rabbi, sisters, can you elaborate on direct relatives? Who do you mean?
Daughters.
Daughters, sisters, mothers.
Right. Cousins can be. Cousins allowed to be.
Cousins can be. All right.
Whoever can marry. In other words, the idea is that if, according to those opinions, that she's considered to be the mother, we don't want the man to have a child with his wife's sister. You understand that? That's the point.
Right.
The only other question is how to be able to prevent later on brothers marrying sisters. That's the only question that exists. And we put in certain mechanisms to avoid it. Now, agencies do have mechanisms. They're not foolproof, because nobody can guarantee that a particular donor will first go with the agency and then she won't go and freelance with a private couple, you understand? So as much as agencies put certain mechanisms and certain codes in place, they're not foolproof. And we're working on other systems to be able to make it much, much more certain that this will not happen, God forbid. So these are just a very, very shallow and very, very general comments on the advantages of having a Jewish donor or disadvantages, things that you have to work through. If you will not be able to certify properly, it's not worth it. Why should you have a Jewish donor? And later on, anyway, to make sure the child's status is not questioned, you have to convert the child anyway. In Australia, it's more complicated. In America, it's those agencies very much available. Other people that go through, they used to go through Ukraine. In Israel, there's a whole Ukrainian system. Today, they mentioned, Joel, I think, mentioned Georgia, but there's also Moldova and other places, Czechia. But in any event, if a non-Jewish donor was used, then we have a protocol, and we talk to the family, we give them all the information in one sitting. We don't believe in telling them, oh, we forgot to tell you this or that. Everything's told all at once. We help Jewish couples around the world in America by the hundreds, because unfortunately the American, but they don't yet have a very clear-cut protocol in this area. And we, just before COVID, 2019, I was invited by the chief rabbi of Israel to have this yearly conference of all the Dayanim, of all of the judges. And I spoke about two subjects, one of them to do with divorces, how to do it in a situation where the husband can't come and you have to be able to do it through internet. What's the best way to do it? And then I spoke about this subject, which is very, very, I'm very passionate about it, because I think that if you don't develop protocols, later on, it's going to be a big problem. In Israel today, you have between 1,000 and 2,000 children born from non-Jewish egg donors, and the Misrad HaPnim registers them as children of the parents. And if we're going to make it very complicated, very bureaucratic, people won't come out. So I presented a halachic position on the policy of how to be able to conduct those conversions. And it was generally accepted. I would say, out of 100 Dayanim, 95, including the chief rabbi, they took on what I said. and there were 5 vehemently opposed to me, but the vast majority accepted it. And subsequently, I was very happy to hear that they actually implemented it as a policy. The same policy we use here in Sydney, and the policy I use in America. And the Rabbanut advertises that those people who have children through non-Jewish egg donors or surrogate mothers should come forward, and they're going to assist them in a very sensitive and discreet way to be able to conduct the conversions.
So we have a question actually, Rabbi, about that process of conversion from one of the attendees who asks, if a child who was conceived from a donor egg is converted as a baby because there's a doubt, do they have the same Jewish status as a regular convert? For example, can they not marry a Kohen? Like, are they the same as a convert?
We have some scholars in the audience because they're asking very good questions. It's something which I wrote about in my book, which I published of my cases that I had. It's very, very difficult to answer those questions properly. They're really good questions. And I would be very happy if you would give my information to those that want to take it, and I'll be able to discuss it with them. The answer is that while I passionately believe that for the protection of a child, we cannot afford to take a very, very extreme view one way or the other, and we must convert children either way. But at the same time, at Pesach, a halachic scholar has the right to be able to have an opinion whether the conversion was done as a me'ikar adin, which means because he believes like Rav Amar, that only the genetic status is the one that controls the status of a child, or like Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, that believes that only the birth, the gestational status, or you may say, look, I really believe one way, so therefore the conversion is only lechumra. There is leeway, that there is room over here to be able to say that the conversion was done only as a stringency, and therefore we could be lenient in such a way. And that's something which I would discuss, also very lenient about how the child is being called to the Torah, not to be called as a convert, how what you put in the ksuba, what you put in the marriage document. We do believe, on one hand, that, once upon a time in Israel, I used to have this long-standing argument with a colleague who was running a very, very famous institute, and they believe that you don't tell children who are born from egg donors. I think that it's a travesty. We have to be able to tell children from young age anything you know about yourself as a young child is not a shock to the system. Anything that you find out later on can really, really unbalance a person and create traumas. And today, everybody finds out. People make genetic tests. One day, I could tell you stories of people are finding out today. It's unbelievable. But I don't have time to tell you stories today, so I just will tell you that
we'll have to have a part 2, Rabbi Ulman's stories about egg donors and conversion. But we're going to end off, Rabbi. We have one more question. Can you tell us what is actually involved in converting a child at birth?
Okay. Again, I always talk to each family individually. There is much room for leniency. As far as, when an adult is converting, the main foundation of a conversion is the acceptance of Jewish lifestyle. That's the main thing for adults. The circumcision for males and immersion for both males and females is a necessary aspect of it, but without accepting the commandments and without accepting the Jewish way of life, it's a meaningless ceremony. With children, it's very different. With children, it's discussed in the Talmud. It's a question of schus, of meriting them. And when it came to adopted children, there was also much argument what is considered to be a standard of the parents' observance in order to convert a child who is adopted. When it comes to converting a child, where there's a debate about the status because one of the mothers is Jewish, there's a lot of leniency, and that's what I spoke about in the conference with the chief rabbi, and I brought proof from the Talmud and the codes why there is room for leniency. And I believe that in most cases, there are a couple of exceptions. In I would say 98% of the cases, leniency should be applied, because Number one, it's a complete opposite of a marriage for a child to be in a Netherlands, where a child on one hand is obligated to keep mitzvahs, on the other hand he can be accepted as a Jew. So for him, it's the worst state to be in, and therefore to take him out of the state is a complete merit for the child. That's one reason. And another reason is because if you don't do that, it will also terrible disservice for the Jewish community, because nobody will know about it. And adopted kids, everybody knows about it. When it comes to those children, it's something which is not publicized. And therefore, it's something that at the end of the day is very beneficial for the whole community. Now, so what we do basically, in Australia and South Africa, we're dealing mainly with very traditional parents who may not be religious, not be fully observant, but they will observe tradition. And we consider this to be a major schus. And therefore, when the child is born, if it's a girl, we wait for the girl to be anything between 6 months and under 3 years old, and we take the girl to mikveh. If it's a boy, we do a bris in such a way that the audience doesn't know that it's done as a part of the conversion. But we have 3 rabbis who observe that all the prayers are said not like a bris for the conversion, it's not like a regular bris for a Jewish child, but there are 3 rabbis who observe, myself and the Moil and a 3rd rabbi, and we make a record of that the bris is kosher for conversion. And again, when the child is anywhere between 6 months and 3 years, we will put the child to the mikveh. That is basically how the conversion is done. With surrogate mothers, there's a few more, a couple of more protocols, nothing major. The families are very happy about it. I won't discuss it today because today we'll talk about egg donors, but that is basically.
Thank you. Wow, Rabbi Ulman, lots of great insight. So we've heard from 3 actually amazing experts, Joel and Denyse from the medical perspective, and Rabbi Ulman from the halachic Jewish perspective. Rabbi Ulman, I'm just going to put it out there on your behalf that anyone who has any questions, who wants a consultation, that we will provide your contact details so that they can reach out to you for anything private that they want to discuss. And I can certainly attest to the fact that I've always found Rabbi Ulman to be very approachable and knowledgeable and accessible and interested, and a real advocate for our community. So thank you, Rabbi Ulman, for your time, and thank you everyone for asking all those great questions. Now, our 3rd panelist this evening, Roseanne Itchikovitz. Roseanne had a very difficult fertility journey. After quite some time, she was blessed with a daughter, and then almost 5 years later with a son. She has supported many people in our community and was herself supported by people in our community during her journey. And from what I know of Roseanne, she is here to help as many people as possible so that they can have better experiences when it comes to their finding their way through to having a child. And so Roseanne, thank you in advance for sharing your story with us. And I'm going to hand over to you. Again, anyone who has any questions, either for Roseanne or for any of our other panelists, please post them in the Q&A. And we will look forward to hearing from Roseanne. Thank you, Roseanne.
Thank you, Justine, and big thank you to the AJFN for hosting this very important evening and for giving me the opportunity to share my story, which I really hope will help somebody. Even if it helps one person out there, then it's good. My story is obviously very challenging and very difficult for me at the time. As Justine mentioned, I'm blessed to have 2 wonderful, wonderful children. My daughter is actually turning 16 tomorrow. So my journey took place over many years, but only in the last few years did I feel confident and even able to share my story. And the AJFN has given me a platform to use that story and use my voice to help other people. And I hope to carry on doing so. So I'll just share my story, which is hopefully going to be of interest to you. So yeah, my husband and I got married quite young, and we went traveling and we worked overseas, and we had about 6 years of running around. And then when I was about 30, we decided it was time to start trying to have a family. So I stopped the contraceptive pill that I'd been on for many, many years. And I expected, that the usual thing would happen, a period would come, and then we'd start trying to fall pregnant. Anyway, within very few weeks, maybe 5 to 6 weeks, no period, and started experiencing the symptoms that I'd read about that you have when you have menopause, hot flushes and feeling tired, and very strange things were happening to me. So I went straight away to my GP, who did a whole lot of blood tests and said I need to go straight away to see a gynecologist to give me more detail. And we went to the gynecologist, and he was so straightforward with us, for which I really am so grateful, because there was no beating around the bush with our story. He said to me, you are in early menopause, you have no eggs, and there is 100% no chance that you will fall pregnant naturally. So obviously that was an absolute hugest shock of my life and my husband's. And after a period of mourning and getting over the shock, we started down the journey of looking for an egg donor, because that was the only option for me to actually carry a child, which is what I desperately wanted to do. So as we've heard from Joel and Denyse, there is not an easy way to find an egg donor in Australia. There's a critical shortage, is actually what Denyse said. And really the only way to use an egg donor in Australia is if you find one yourself, and then you bring your donor to the clinic, and then you can proceed with the IVF process from there. So the easiest option for me was to ask my sister, which our rabbi said was a totally acceptable thing to do. And I did ask my sister, and she was willing. It was amazing. She had already had one child, and she did want more, but we were told that it wouldn't affect her fertility and she could be our egg donor. Slight issue was that she was living in South Africa at the time, and we were living in Australia. So we found a clinic there, and we found a clinic here that would work together, and I got all the drugs and things I needed here, and she went through the process there. And then we flew to South Africa when it was the right time. And when it came time to do the egg retrieval from her, there were no eggs, none. So that was very scary, and the doctor tried to look for reasons, and he found that the drugs hadn't been administered properly to my sister. So thank goodness, we all felt relief. There was a reason for it. It wasn't unexplained. And so we thought we'd try again 6 months later. So 6 months later, we did the whole thing again, and we got there, and my sister had a few eggs, and none of them actually progressed to the right stage for us to use to implant the embryos. So that was a real point of devastation for me, because I had felt at that point that even though it wasn't my egg, it was my sister's egg, so it was still my parents' genetic grandchild and still within our family genes, and I felt I could cope with that in my head. But now that was no longer an option. I only have one sister, and that was not going to be an option. So now the next part was to find another donor. And we were told by the clinic and by some counselors to speak to people at work, speak to your friends, speak to everyone. And I couldn't. I could not bring myself to discuss it with a single person outside of my very close family. It was just too hard. I mean, there was no ways I could have spoken to people at work who had no idea what we were going through. I just couldn't. So it was a very difficult time, but my husband happened one night while I was overseas, he happened to speak to a beautiful, beautiful friend of mine and tell her our situation. And she immediately said, she'll do it. She'll be our donor. And so we spoke a lot, and I tried to, see if she understood all the consequences, and her husband had to go for counseling, and we went for counseling, and the four of us went for counseling. And she was convinced she wanted to do it. She already had one child and wanted to have another. But, everyone said there's no problem, so off you go. So we did a round of IVF with her. She had probably 18 eggs, I think, which was a huge number. And about 11 of them were fertilized embryos and ready to be used. And so we put in one fresh embryo and did the blood test a few days later, and I was pregnant. It was unbelievable, the biggest joy. And 9 months later, my daughter was born. So it was an incredible end to that fertility journey. And we were happy for a while like that. But then you know, we started to feel that a second child would be a wonderful thing. We didn't want our child to be an only child. If we could make a second child happen, that was what we really wanted to do. So we thought, well, there's a same success rate with frozen embryos as there is with fresh. So we proceeded to do, I think, 9 or 10 rounds of IVF over the next year, putting in one at a time the frozen embryos that we had, and each one did not work. Each blood test for pregnancy was negative. I mean, I got to a point where I couldn't even take the phone call from the clinic to hear what the blood result was. I just said to them, I don't want to know, just send me a text message. At one point, it became so all-consuming that my husband said to me, you are having a break from this situation. You have to focus on our child that we do have, and your body needs a rest. And we just took a break of about 6 months. And then we carried on. And we got to the end of all the frozen embryos, and we had no more success. So during this time, I'll just rewind a little bit. The friend who had donated the eggs was then, in the meantime, trying to conceive naturally herself and was struggling. And that became a very difficult time between us and her. It was very difficult to share our happiness of our baby with her struggling to have another one. So that was a very hard time, and it took a lot of emotional, there was a lot of emotional talks and things that happened during that time. Anyway, I have to say, thank God she did, after a year, fall pregnant. And thank God, yeah, that was good. And our relationship and friendship has only strengthened and blossomed since then. And my children and her children love each other, joke that they're half siblings, and everyone's open about it, and it's really beautiful. Anyway, when she saw that we were trying all these frozen embryos that weren't working, she came to me one day and said, I know you want another one. I'm going to donate again. And I couldn't believe it, because I hadn't asked her. I hadn't, you know, put any pressure whatsoever on her. And it was just miraculous of her to do that. Just, she's an absolute angel. Anyway, her one condition was to change clinics, which we gladly did. She felt that having the 18 embryo eggs originally was too much, and that had caused some damage to her. So we gladly, I mean, we would have followed her to Timbuktu if she'd asked. So we did. We went to the doctor she requested, and we did. She did a second round of treatment, and she had about 6 eggs that time, which she was happy with. The doctor was happy. And we put in the first fresh egg, and we all thought this is going to be it, because that's what worked the first time. And it was negative. It didn't work. So a few months later, we tried the first frozen embryo, and it worked. And so our son was born after that. So that was our beautiful story at the second doctor. And we did thereafter, a few years later, try one by one with the remaining frozen embryos, and they didn't work. But I wasn't, it was more like we had them and they were so precious. There was no ways we could have not used them. I mean, that would have just been, it was unthinkable to not use them. So we did. And then when they didn't work, I was sad for a day or two, but we really, really grateful for the 2 miracles that we have. And that's where we are. And even after, once they were born, I mean, I really told so few people what we were going through. And it's only in the last few years, with the help of AJFN, that I've been able to share my story. So
I think everyone is speechless, Roseanne. You've stolen the show. So I have a few questions for you. Firstly, to just acknowledge a huge thank you for sharing your story. It's very brave of you to be so open, and I love the fact that you've been open with your kids. I think, you know, what Rabbi Ulman was saying before about how important it is to not hide anything, so that we can all, I guess, live successfully together and not burden our children, is amazing. We've just had an anonymous comment to say, Roseanne, that was incredible. So I echo that. Thank you. were you ever worried that the children that you would have from the donor eggs would look different to you? Was that ever a concern for you?
Absolutely, that was a huge concern, and that was why using my sister was, seemed like the best option. But my donor friend doesn't look like me. We don't look the same. But the amazing thing is that my children look exactly like my husband.
Wow.
So anyone who sees them just says, oh, you're a splitting image of your father. And some people have made jokes, oh, did you just carry this baby, but it's all his? And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly. And then, I do have the odd person who says, oh, my daughter's hair is exactly like mine, or her eyes are exactly mine. And I just nod and say, yeah. Yeah, but just back to your first point,
yes.
The clinic actually made it a condition of using donor eggs was that we had to disclose to the children. And she said that they helped me how to do it. They said there's a book, a kid's book, that says it takes 3 to make a baby, and it's the mom, the dad, and the donor. And the book is like a children's story. And then at the back, it repeats the story and it leaves space for you to put your pictures, your photos of you, the father, and the mother, the father, and the donor. And they encourage you to start reading the storybook to your children when they're as young as like 18 months, 2 years, so that when they do come to understand, they just know, it's not a surprise to them at all. There's no shock whatsoever. It's just, you got your eggs from someone else. And we had a funny incident that we were at my donor's house once for a meal with a lot of other people who didn't know our story. And my little daughter, she was probably 4 at the time, turned around to my donor and said, thanks for the eggs. And the other people thought, she'd lent me a dozen eggs. But anyway, they strongly encourage, they insist that you tell your children.
Wow. I'm just looking at all the questions. Okay. Yeah. We have another comment from someone. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Roseanne. You give us all hope. So thank you to whoever posted that comment.
What I hope to do.
That's what you hope to do, I know. Is there anything, Roseanne, that you would have done differently on your journey? That you feel comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I don't know. I could say now that I should have spoken to more people, got more support along the way. I had friends who didn't know at all. I've got some friends watching this seminar tonight who had no idea that I had any fertility challenges whatsoever, never mind donors and anything else. So I probably should have shared with people to give myself more support. This is what we tell everyone from the AJFN. Share with us so we can support you. We can help you. You don't need to feel alone. And yet I did feel alone, and I was alone, and it was because I didn't share my story, and it made it harder. And yeah, so that's maybe what I should have done, but it was hard at the time. It was hard.
Okay, so you've answered the question about how do you explain to your child how they were conceived. So you had a great book. How much involvement does your donor have in your children's life? Obviously very present, and it's all very open. Do you feel obliged to keep your donor updated? Obviously, again, that in your instance is not an issue. One final question that I have for you. Were you ever concerned that you wouldn't bond with the child? Like, was that ever a worry for you?
I had that concern before I fell pregnant. I did, for my first, because I already then knew for my second. But yeah, logically I felt that concern. But once, if you consider that the thing that is being donated is minuscule, you can't see it with your naked eye almost. And for 9 months, it lived in me and became, both of my kids were 4 kilos at birth. So it went from less than a pinprick to 4 kilos because of me, because of what my body gave it to grow. Yes, the seed came from someone else, but it grew in my body because of me. So as soon as I felt pregnant, and when you start feeling the baby moving and you see your tummy growing and it's yours. It's 100% yours. Like, it's just no one else's. And then obviously once the baby's born, it's yours. So that concern was there before falling pregnant, but once I was visibly, or I could feel that I was pregnant, that concern fell away.
Amazing. And one final question. Have your children's reactions to your story ever been challenging for you? Or to the story of their creation? Okay.
No, I mean, my daughter's very open about everything. I mean, she asked me questions about what's going on with her puberty and whatever, which I'm shy to answer. I mean, she has no, problems asking anything. She's said some things like, she's asked me when do I think she's going to get her period? She goes, oh, do you think I might have the same issue that you did? Oh, no, I wouldn't have that issue because I didn't, we need to ask my donor, did she? So then we'll get on a call with the donor, we did this. Or she wanted to know, when do I think her period's going to start? At what age? What age did mine start? So I said, well, I mean, at first I don't really remember, but it's not really relevant. And then, we get on a call with my donor friend and her daughter, who's closer to my daughter's age. And then we have this beautiful conversation. So some of it is, I didn't grow up talking about periods and puberty and all of this, but my daughter's got no qualms talking about it. And I think it might come from the openness of this discussion from the beginning, which maybe, some mothers don't have this open discussion with their naturally conceived children. It's just we were really encouraged to have this whole discussion at a very early age.
Wow. And clearly, so it's something that you've managed beautifully in your family. And I guess in that way, you're very blessed.
People have praised me for how openly I talk to my child about puberty and whatever. And I said, well, it's not coming from me, it's coming from her. I mean, if she didn't ask, I probably wouldn't say. But she asks a lot of questions.
Thank you, Roseanne, for sharing. Really just humbling to hear your story. And we're so grateful to have you as part of the AJFN family.
Thank you, Justine.
Along with Rabbi Ulman and Joel and Denyse. All of you make up the tapestry of support that people need when they're going through this journey. And I'm just going to close off by reminding everybody, we're reading in the Torah some beautiful stories about the biblical mothers and fathers, many of whom experienced infertility. And I think we should never forget that infertility is part of our legacy as a people and how we respond to the infertility experiences of those around us. We can learn so much from the biblical narrative and from the stories that precede us. So if you're sitting in shul, just know that this is not a new story, and we're definitely not alone in experiencing this and in supporting people around us who are experiencing this. So as you'll see up on the screen now is a slide with the various ways that you can reach out to people in the AJFN support team. You will be getting in a post-event email the contact details for our speakers in case you want to reach out to them. Please don't hesitate to ask for support. As Roseanne said, being alone is not the way to go. And the one thing she wishes she did differently was to reach out. So reach out. We're here, whatever you need. Have a great evening, everyone.